This incredible story, which began in 1977, shocked the world with its denouement 34 years later. A young mother took her 6-month-old baby and went to a store near her home. She never returned home. Police couldn't find any trace of her. It took several decades for everyone to learn the truth and realize that such twisted plots don't just happen in the movies. This story began in the sunny American state of Hawaii. In early 1977, a young couple, 26-year-old Mark Barnes and 31-year-old Charlotte Moriarty, a son was born, who was named Marks. It seemed that the family was waiting for a happy and carefree future among palm trees, sunshine, and endless ocean. Mark worked as a veterinarian and Charlotte was an artist. The couple was not married, which did not prevent them from loving their child and giving him all the best. Before meeting Mark, Charlotte had managed to be married and had a daughter, who stayed to live with her father in New Mexico after the divorce. Her mother kept in touch with her and tried to visit her whenever possible. Let's move forward to June 24, 1977. On that day, Mark had been working on the property since early morning. They had recently built a terrace, and the man was planting Charlotte's favorite flowers around it. The girl told him she wanted to walk to the store in order not to distract Mark from his work. She decided to take her son with her, put him in the stroller and left. Several hours passed. Mark was so worked up that he didn't realize it right away. Charlotte should have been back by now, since the store was only a few blocks away. After waiting a few more hours, he decided to walk to the store, hoping to meet Charlotte on the way. As he walked away from the house, he saw his son's empty stroller standing near the bus stop. Neither the child nor Charlotte was anywhere to be found. It would seem that after this should have immediately contacted the police, but Mark didn't. As he explained later, Charlotte could sometimes go somewhere for a few days without warning and then return home. The man figured this time would be no exception. Sounds pretty weird. If Charlotte had gone alone, Mark's logic would have been understandable. But she'd taken her 6-month-old baby with her, abandoned the stroller in the middle of the street and vanished. 2 days passed, but Charlotte never showed up. So Mark decided to call the police, and they advised him to wait a few more days. Maybe the girl and the baby would come home. The man did so, and 2 days later he called the police again. This time he was asked to give a description of Charlotte and the child, and then promised to start a search. But after that call, no one contacted Mark, and the fate of his girlfriend and son remained a mystery. 3 weeks passed. Mark decided to come to the police station to find out how the search was progressing, and here the weirdness continued. There he was told that no calls had been received from him. The police allegedly couldn't find any evidence that Mark had informed them by phone that the girl and the child were missing. Of course, no case was opened, and all this time no one was looking for the missing. Let's dwell on this point further. Mark assured everyone that he had called the police twice. The police said that any call is registered, and his calls simply did not happen. We don't know which one of them is right, but both scenarios are possible. If the police really refused to start looking for the 6-month-old child, they could be in serious trouble. Missing small children oblige the police to start searching immediately, even if only a few hours have passed since the disappearance. Therefore, in this case, the police may well have concealed the fact that they did not search for the infant. The father's behavior also seems strange. Why did he wait several days before calling the police? And were those calls made? Even if he did call, why did he wait another 3 weeks after those calls and only then decide to go to the station? After all, in all that time he hadn't even called there to find out anything about the progress of the investigation. In his conversation with the detectives, Mark said that Charlotte might have some kind of mental problem. In the 70s, psychiatry was still gaining momentum, so the girl did not receive any treatment. She or Mark didn't even go to the hospital. Here was a very good reason to do so. According to Mark, for the first few weeks after giving birth, Charlotte walked around the house with only a blindfold on her eyes and couldn't properly explain why. Given that there could be no logical explanation, Mark was worried and was already thinking about going to the doctors. But then Charlotte removed the bandage and he began to behave absolutely normally. The man decided to forget about this story and not to give it any importance. About the fact that Charlotte's disappearance may be associated with mental problems, indirectly spoke another fact. Mark said that her daughter, who was 8 years old at the time, was going to fly to Hawaii in June to visit her mother. Charlotte was looking forward to this meeting, but at the last moment the girl's father cancelled all plans and told Charlotte that this summer they would not come. This very much upset the girl, and mental deviations can be provoked by strong negative emotions that Charlotte experienced. Even if in calm stages of life a person does not show any signs of unstable mentality. But all these theories did not bring the police any closer to finding the girl and her son. They opened a case, put up flyers around the neighborhood, and couldn't find a single clue. Mark later recounted that for a year and a half after Charlotte and his son disappeared, he was obsessed with finding them. He traveled all over the island, hoping to find them alive and unharmed. But it never happened. 2 years after they went missing, he moved to California. The police didn't hold out much hope for the case either. Given the complete lack of evidence, no one believed that the girl and the child could be found. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the most important time for the search was lost in the first few days. 24 years had passed. Mark had started a new family and had 2 daughters. He had long since given up believing that he would one day see Charlotte and Mark's alive. But in 2001, the case took a new turn. Charlotte's daughter from her first marriage, Jennifer, flew to Hawaii and went to the police station. She convinced them to reopen the case of her mother's disappearance. The detectives agreed, entered Charlotte and Mark's information into the missing persons database, and created a computerized portrait of an adult Marks based on his childhood photo. The first thing the detectives decided to do was to interview Marks, as his behavior in the early stages of the investigation had struck them as odd. There was nothing in the old documents about the man calling the police station by phone 2 days after the girl and child disappeared. It said he didn't come to the police station until 3 weeks later. This led detectives to believe that Mark may have been involved in their disappearance. Despite the fact that 24 years had passed since then, the police tried to find any witnesses who lived near Mark and Charlotte's home. Of course, most of the residents had moved on, but the detectives were lucky enough to find one retired man who had lived there at the time. He remembered Mark and Charlotte and told the detectives an interesting fact. According to the pensioner, the couple often quarreled, and he heard them screaming. The detectives then decided that the case was close to being solved, and Mark was indeed guilty. He was called in for questioning and told about the witness who heard their regular quarrels with Charlotte. Mark did not deny that there were indeed verbal altercations between them. He also asked to be shown a married couple who would never fight. Detectives tried their best to prove his guilt and offered Mark a voluntary polygraph interview. The results were mixed. The specialist who read the testimony could not give an expressive answer whether the man was guilty or not. The polygraph is inherently an overrated tool. It is physically incapable of showing whether a suspect is lying or not. Dozens of factors can affect its results. Lies can be mistaken for truth and vice versa. If an innocent person is very nervous during an interrogation or withholds completely different information that's relevant to the questions, a polygraph can make him look like a liar. In Mark's case, the polygraph was also of no use, but detectives decided to come at it from a different angle. They obtained a warrant to examine the house where Charlotte and Mark lived in 1977. They were most interested in the terrace, built shortly before the girl and child went missing. According to their version, Charlotte could not have gone anywhere that day and suffered at the hands of her husband during another quarrel and ended up in the ground under the terrace. It is not quite clear how the police imagined the events of that day and how the infant fits into this story, but they had no other versions. Forensic investigators dug up the backyard and examined the terrace, but they were unable to find any trace of anyone's remains there. It is unknown if they compensated the new homeowners for the 2 days of digging in their backyard. Detectives recognized they had nothing more to work with and put the case on hold again. As a last resort, They took DNA samples from Jennifer and Mark in hopes that it would someday help. The case went on hold again for a full 10 years. But after that time, the grand finale of the whole tangled story came. Steve Carter, 35, from Philadelphia, has wondered about his past from an early age. He grew up in an orphanage and was adopted at the age of 4 by a wealthy New Jersey couple. A U.S. Army officer and his wife loved the baby and cared for him as if he were their own. Steve also loved his foster parents, but he always wondered how he ended up in the orphanage. In 2011, he came across an article online that told the amazing story of Carlina White, who was abducted from the hospital when she was just 19 days old. Decades later, Carlina was browsing missing children's websites, found her childhood photo there, and was horrified to realize that it was her current parents who had abducted her from the hospital. Steve Carter was inspired by this story and began researching the same sites. He entered his birth details on his birth certificate and was immediately at a loss for words. The first result showed an adult picture of him, taken by artists based on a baby picture. The resemblance was so strong that Carter couldn't even move from shock. He realized that he was the same Mark Barnes, who had disappeared in Hawaii with his birth mother. After recovering from the shock, Steve made the decision to take a DNA test, taking advantage of such an opportunity through a missing children search service. In their database were DNA samples of Mark and Jennifer, taken by the police 10 years ago. After 8 months of waiting, the test showed an exact match. Steve Carter turned out to be Mark Barnes. Police instantly reopened the investigation. The missing infant found himself 34 years later, but the circumstances of his disappearance were still a mystery. Not for long, though. His birth certificate helped solve the mystery. Firstly, the certificate was not issued until a year after the child was born. Secondly, his name was listed as Tenzin Amia, and his mother's name was Jane Amia. This helped the police to connect the two key threads, as the name had already appeared in the reports. Not long after Charlotte and the baby disappeared, police received a strange call. A woman reported that a girl with an infant had knocked on the door of her house and asked for milk to feed her baby. The police arrived on the scene and believed that the girl was in an inadequate state. She was taken to a psychiatric clinic for evaluation, and the infant was handed over to the guardianship authorities. That girl was Charlotte. After a few days in the hospital, she secretly escaped from there, and no one ever saw her again. And the child was left in the care of the state, because he didn't even have a birth certificate. Not even a birth certificate, and there was no way to identify his relatives. When the truth was revealed, everyone had a legitimate question. Why didn't the police compare the disappearance of the girl and the child with another situation, especially when the infant was left in the care of the state? Did they fail to realize that the child in front of them was the same child? Now, 34 years later, it is difficult to answer that question. Perhaps the police simply didn't know about the disappearance, because the two cases were handled by two different precincts. Steve, who by then was working a prestigious job and had a family of his own, decided to make contact with his half-sister and biological father. They were shocked when the man himself revealed his own disappearance. No one believed anymore that that infant could still be alive. Even though we don't know what happened to Charlotte, the ending of this story can definitely be considered a happy one. Sad statistics tell us that the chances of finding missing children after so many years are nil. But the case of Mark Barnes was one of the rare exceptions. He grew up in a wonderful family, had a good upbringing, and became a successful man. Most likely, Charlotte did suffer from a serious mental disorder. She knocked on a stranger's door, asking for milk to feed her son. A call to the police may have saved the infant's life. Who knows how Charlotte's mental state would have changed later on? It is still unknown what happened to her, and it is unlikely that this mystery will ever be solved. Given that she never tried to contact her husband or find her son, the woman could have died a short time after escaping from the hospital. Perhaps timely medical attention could have changed the girl's condition for the better, and the whole story would never have happened.